Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is neurotheology. My guest is Dr. Andrew Newberg, who is Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health, and he is a physician at the Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia. He has co-authored some 10 books on the subject of neurotheology, including How God Changes Your Brain, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, Words Can Change Your Brain, The Rabbi's Brain, The Mystical Mind, Why God Won't Go Away, Neurotheology, Principles of Neurotheology, and The Metaphysical Mind, Probing the Biology of Philosophical Thought. This is an internet interview, and I'll switch over now to that video. Welcome, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be with you and to talk about neurotheology. Who coined the term?
So it's actually a little bit of an interesting question because the first mention of it is actually in a book by Aldous Huxley called The Island, written in 1961, I believe. Mm-hmm. And but he just sort of mentions it as a concept and doesn't really elaborate much on it. He just talks about this futuristic society, which one of the things that they do is neurotheology, but doesn't say what it is. Uh-huh. And probably the first academic article that came out was actually in 1984. James Ashbrook wrote an article that was titled Neurotheology. So that may be the first sort of academic use of it. And then my colleague Gene DeCrilly and I started using the concept in the early 1990s and taken off from there.
Aldous Huxley, that's a very auspicious origin for the term, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
He was a great visionary writer. And what made you decide to make this your discipline?
Well, I guess that, in many ways this was something that has been going on in my mind since I was very young. I was always asking a lot of questions, always trying to understand the nature of reality, how we as human beings experience that reality. And so as I went through my education, I sort of started thinking about the human brain and what the human brain is doing and how it helps us to make some sense out of the world. But then I also realized that there were certain limitations about what our brain can do and how we can understand things from that perspective. So I started to take courses in college in Hindu and Buddhist thought and comparative religions, and then and all the while sort of thinking in my own mind about how to address these fundamental questions about the nature of reality. And so finally, when I was in medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, I had the very good fortune of working with two wonderful mentors, One of them was the imaging person, where I learned how to do brain imaging studies of all different things, and Alzheimer's disease, depression, all those variety of neurological and psychiatric conditions. And then I also met up with this Eugene DeQuilly, who was a psychiatrist and who had also been exploring some of these questions actually since the mid-1970s. And at some point, as we were working on all these different things, I realized, well, gee, we can actually use the brain scans to study depression or study Alzheimer's disease. Why can't we use them to study spirituality and religion? And that was in many ways what kind of launched, certainly in a more active way, this whole field of neurotheology for me, and being able to see what this relationship was between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves.
I gather that our knowledge of the brain itself has increased dramatically in the last 40 years or so since I was an undergraduate, and they were doing the very first EEG studies of meditators.
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of what has made neurotheology be able to advance to the level that it has most recently has been the advent of a variety of different imaging techniques. So functional MRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to be able to look at the brain and how our brain is working during different states and different tasks. Some of the nuclear medicine imaging that I do, which includes things like PET imaging, positron emission tomography, or SPECT imaging, single photon emission computed tomography. These are all different ways of essentially looking at how our brain works. And so we've utilized each of these tools as a way of trying to look at what goes on in the brain when the person is engaged in a practice like meditation or prayer. And in contrast to some of the early EEG studies that just kind of looked, broadly at what's going on with the brain, we can get very, very detailed in terms of looking at the specific areas of the brain. And also we've done some more recent studies looking at neurotransmitters. So looking at changes going on at the level of things like dopamine and serotonin, some of the chemicals in the brain that may be very intimately involved in these experiences.
When you think about the brain, it's such a complex organ. You've got all of these substructures in the brain and various neural networks and bundles of nerves communicating with each other and neurochemicals. And I've even learned recently there's some new studies about slow wave electromagnetic signals that can jump from one area of the brain to the other, recently discovered in mice. So I should think even after you gather all this data, it's still very puzzling. What do you make of it?
Well, I guess, any good area of research like neurotheology almost produces more questions than it does answers. And you're right. I mean, on one hand, it is remarkable the technologies that we have. We've been able to peer into the brain better than we ever have before. But you're also right. I mean, the brain is extraordinarily complex. The way the different parts of the brain work with each other. There's been a lot of emphasis more recently in not just studying, a particular area of the brain, but networks of the brain and thinking about how different parts of the brain interact with each other. So that's very, very important. And even in some of our early models of meditative or spiritual practices, we were trying to construct a kind of network concept to look at all the different areas of the brain. There's not just one part of the brain that turns on when we meditate or pray. It seems like it's something that actually involves many different parts of our brain. And in fact, when I get asked, is there a spiritual part of the brain? I usually say, well, yes, it's the whole brain. I mean, it's really every different aspect of the brain. And of course, I work within an integrative medicine center, so we realize that the brain is also intimately connected with the body. And so in many ways, if there's a spiritual part of ourselves, it really is our whole self. But you also raise another interesting point, which is, and I bring this up a lot with my colleagues and students, which is that when we do think about the brain and its complexities, we have the actual firing of a neuron involves sodium and potassium rushing across the cell membrane and generating the kind of electrical signals that get picked up on an EEG. We have changes in metabolism. We have changes in blood flow. We have neurons that are connected with millions of other neurons. We have neurotransmitters that get released and slowly move across the synapses. And maybe some of the new things, as you said, some of these new frequencies and so forth. Where within all of that are our thoughts, our consciousness? Can we draw some type of truly reductive conclusion and say, okay, it's within these neurons that's where our consciousness lies, or is it the entire processing of the brain, or is there something beyond just the purely material aspects of our brain that our brain is able to connect into? And that's certainly something that I have been very fascinated by and explored a lot. Traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism, the notion of a kind of universal consciousness from which our brain has essentially come from, as opposed to the other way around. So it's consciousness creating the material world instead of the material world of our brain creating consciousness. And to me, this is hopefully a wonderful area for neurotheology to move into, because of the altered states of consciousness that are part of spiritual practices and spiritual belief systems, as well as bringing in what's going on from the neuroscience side. So there's a tremendous amount for us yet to learn.
Mm-hmm. Well, I should think in the area of neurotheology, there are actually these days quite a few controversies. I know there's some neurologists I've interviewed who maintain that the brain doesn't create consciousness at all. It's a receiver of consciousness, kind of like a television set. And that seems almost diametrically opposed to the standard view of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that to me is why I really feel very strongly about the value of neurotheology and a neurotheological approach. I talked about this in a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and the idea of really being open to all paradigms. There is value in being reductionistic at times, and there's a value in not. And there may be some very important things that we can learn, and in fact, we hopefully can design studies that will show us perhaps a whole new way of understanding what the brain is. Maybe it is truly just a receiver, and when we see these changes, it's just the brain responding to the world around us, the consciousness around us, the spiritual realm around us, or maybe it really is generating these experiences. And so, part of what neurotheology is about, I think, is to be open to both sides of this equation, to be open to what our brain is doing, and to be respectful of both sides too. And that to me is always important as well, that we need to truly appreciate what various spiritual traditions have had to say about the nature of consciousness and about the nature of the material world around us. And we need to be very respectful and do good science and be careful about conclusions, and work towards generating studies and doing studies that may shed light on some fascinating issues and questions, and may ultimately lead to some very substantial paradigm shifts that may change the entire way that the scientific world thinks about things, or the spiritual world thinks about things.
I recently had an opportunity to interview Pim van Lommel, who is a cardiologist in the Netherlands, who has done some prospective studies of people experiencing near-death experience. In other words, in advance, these are cardiac patients, and a certain percentage of them, when they come into a hospital for a procedure, they're going to experience a cardiac arrest. And so he interviewed those people and found that, I think about 18% of them experienced a classical near-death experience with all of the features. And he said he looked at everything, oxygen intake and all of the theories that skeptics have proposed for a materialistic explanation of the near-death experience. And he said none of those factors discriminated between the cardiac arrest patients who had a near-death experience and those who did not. So he says, as far as he's concerned, the data is in. The conventional materialistic explanation fails to account for the empirical observations.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of research that we need to continue to do. I mean, I think that there is a lot for us to be able to explore. Experiences like near-death experiences are a unique opportunity, I think, to be able to explore and to understand what's happening as best as possible. And so, I'd love to see more of that data. I know that there's some other people who've been doing research. The out-of-body component of these experiences is very prominent. And there should be ways that, people often talk about seeing other parts of the room, or that the nurse had red hair. There should be ways of very clearly and definitively testing that and being able to make those types of conclusions. So, it's great to see, what helps us to understand or what helps us to not understand, the nature of these experiences, and trying to explore, what physiological processes may be involved, but what else may also be involved. And again, it's always essential for us to be open to those sides. And the data that you're just talking about, I'm sure if you were going to take a critical analysis of it, you might say, well, there still could be other physiological things that we haven't been able to measure. So just the fact that the ones that we thought it might account for the experience don't work doesn't mean that there aren't others. But on the other hand, as he concluded with that, one really has to take very seriously the possibility that there is something completely different that we haven't been able to measure, or that we can't simply reduce to what's going on biologically.
I'm sure that as a student of the human nervous system and the brain, you have a healthy appreciation for the human capacity for delusions.
Especially when it comes to this concept of religious and spiritual beliefs. Of course, there has been a number of people, particularly those who have a more materialistic or atheist perspective, to say that the people who have these experiences are having some type of psychotic episode or some type of delusion. And again, to me, there's a lot of pieces to this neurotheology puzzle. And so, you mentioned near-death experiences, disorders, brain disorders and psychological disorders are another part of that puzzle, because there are some people who have had known issues, known illnesses, whether it's seizures or a tumor or something like that, who have very unusual experiences that are spiritual or spiritual-like. And so that should tell us something about the nature of these experiences. There's been some research that shows that when people have abnormalities in certain parts of the brain, that they're more prone to having a spiritual experience than if they're in other parts of the brain. So that tells us something about them. But on the other hand, we have to be cautious about being over pathological about things and say, not getting to the conclusion then that because there were a few people who had seizures that had unusual spiritual experiences, that therefore everyone who has a spiritual experience must be having a seizure. Two different kinds of conclusions. And so while it provides some interesting and important information for us, we have to be cautious about what we can say. We have to study things carefully. And if we ultimately can come to the conclusion that everyone who believes in God is delusional, well, if that's the conclusion that's drawn perfectly from the data, then we may have to accept that. On the other hand, we are much more likely, I think, will find that these people that everyone who has a spiritual experience or near-death experience is a completely normal person who's having an experience of altered consciousness that's maybe associated with changes in the brain, maybe associated with changes in energy fields or consciousness fields that are things that we can't currently measure through science. So there's a lot for us to continue to explore, and that to me is also a fundamental principle of neurotheology, which is to use, all the technologies available, but to also recognize the limitations and the things that we can miss, and have to keep pushing the envelope both scientifically as well as from the more spiritual or philosophical perspective.
Well, I guess when you look at the human species as a whole, it's pretty clear that virtually every culture, every tribal group has some form of religion or spirituality as part of their culture. And I suppose it's also fair to say we don't see that in any other animal species.
Certainly in the kind of fully elaborated aspect of religion, we typically do not see this in other species. Of course, there's always that language barrier, so we don't, I don't fully know if my dog believes in God or not. But a lot of the early research that I did with my colleagues, and particularly with Eugene DeQuilly, looked at the relationship between animals and animal rituals, and how that related to the various rituals that human beings perform, especially in the religious or spiritual context. And we find a really great similarity in terms of our biologies as well. You know, a lot of what goes on in practices like meditation or prayer are changes in our autonomic nervous system that connects our brain to our body. And we see this as well in animal studies. Animals that are engaged in rituals, particularly mating rituals, which are the most common type of ritual in the animal kingdom, activate their autonomic nervous system. And in some sense, the ultimate goals of rituals, whether they're in an animal or a human, and of course humans are animals too, is this notion that this ability to kind of connect with something. In the animal world, the mating rituals help two animals connect with each other. They feel at one with each other. They feel that sense of connectedness, that sense of oneness. Well, when people have religious or spiritual experience through the practice of various rituals like meditation or prayer, that is sort of the ultimate outcome of many of these experiences, that sense of oneness, that sense of connectedness, either with the rest of the group of people who you are with all of humanity, with God, with the universe. And we have done in some of our brain imaging studies, we've looked at a variety of areas of the brain that might be involved with these kinds of experiences. And for example, the parietal lobe, which is located in the back of the brain, this is an area that normally takes our sensory information and helps us to establish our sense of self and how that self relates to the world. So we have found that when people are engaged in very deep meditative practices, for example, that parietal lobe activity starts to quiet down. And as that happens, if that normally helps us to have our sense of self, then as that area quiets down, the person begins to lose that sense of self and feels that sense of oneness and connectedness. And of course, other animal species also have a parietal lobe. So we might expect that there is some rudimentary elements of spirituality, or some, at the very least, some sense of transcendence or connectedness that animals have with other animals around them or with a mate, that may ultimately have been elaborated in much greater detail in the human brain, which is much more complex and much larger, at least relative to our body size, than virtually every other animal.
It's fascinating now when you describe it that way. For example, parrots seem to be very intelligent animals. They seem to have a certain amount of language ability, and yet their brains are tiny compared to human brains.
Right. Well, so it's not just, size does matter, but it's also the complexity that matters. And the more complex a brain is, the more it is able to do different things and have different kinds of experiences and perhaps express consciousness. And I mean, you mentioned different types of birds like parrots. There is some evidence that consciousness itself, a self-awareness at least, is something that exists in certain animal species, like dolphins, for example, or certain primates. They will stare at a mirror longer, or they will, if you put like some piece of paint on a monkey, he doesn't reach for the mirror, he reaches to himself if he sees himself in a mirror, so that there can be a self-recognition. And even in if you go into evolution, with Neanderthals, for example, there's evidence of spiritual beliefs, the way they buried people with different trinkets and weapons and things like that. The notion that there's something more to us than just our biological selves. Now, their brain was probably more comparable to our brain than perhaps to a parrot's brain, but they also didn't have the same level of complexity and the same level of language and abstract thought, but they were starting to develop some of these ideas. So again, it'll be interesting to see how well we can tie these correlations in terms of the sense of spirituality and the sense of oneness and connectedness that people have, going back into the animal kingdom, to see, how far back that may ultimately go. It may be more than we think. And again, if there's, what's interesting is that if one takes a scientific perspective, one could see this because we see the development of the brain from animal to animal. And we could say, okay, well, it starts, here and ultimately elaborates into the human brain. And certainly if there's a universal consciousness, then, or some type of universal energy that we tap into, it makes sense that all animals would have the ability to tap into that in some way. And, maybe human beings more so than others. But certainly the ability to have those feelings and have those experiences and have that level of consciousness is potentially very possible, even into some of the simplest types of animals.
Well, I certainly know people who would tell me that their cats enter into a meditative state. And I know people who tell me their dogs can enter into a state of unconditional love, which is considered a highly spiritual state.
Absolutely. Right. So, when you look at the brains of cats and dogs and other species, a lot of the same areas, the parietal lobes, the limbic system, which is part of our emotional centers. You're talking about the feelings of love. These are areas that also become activated when human beings are engaged in practices like meditation, especially like a loving kindness meditation or various prayer practices where they feel the love of God. Very likely there is a lot of overlap there.
I know you have looked at a variety of spiritual practices, even speaking in tongues. You've attempted to identify what goes on in the brain when that happens.
We've been very fortunate over the past 2 decades, really. We've probably scanned about 400 or so people doing all different kinds of practices, meditation practices, prayer practices, other spiritual practices. You mentioned the speaking in tongues. And we've used a variety of imaging approaches. One of the common ones that we've used is something called SPECT imaging, which works very well because the way it works is that we inject people with a little bit of a radioactive tracer, we call it, that follows blood flow as it gets up into the brain. And the more an area of the brain is active, the more blood flow it gets, and the less active it is, the less blood flow it gets. And what we have found is that we can do this technique where we can actually inject the person outside of the scanner while they're doing their practice. So when people were speaking in tongues, they were standing, they were moving around, dancing around, and then at the sort of the peak of doing the speaking in tongues, we would inject them. They would continue to do the practice, and then when the practice was over, we could put them into the scanner, and then the image that we acquire is based on where that tracer went at the time of the injection, which is when they were speaking in tongues or when they were meditating. And then we can look at the brain and say, okay, what are the areas that turn on? What are the areas that turn off? And where are the similarities and differences across different practices? So, we've talked about this a little bit, but in practices like prayer or meditation where the person has that loss of the sense of self, we see the parietal lobe areas actually starting to quiet down. When it comes to practices like meditation and prayer, where the person has a great deal of attention and concentration on an image, an object, a phrase or mantra, we tend to see increases of activity in the frontal lobes, located behind the forehead, that we know that this is an area that's involved in helping us to focus our attention. So it makes sense then that we would see increased activity in this area because the person is concentrating and focusing in on the practice itself. So we're getting a much more fuller ability to understand all the different parts of the brain and how they are activated or deactivated depending on the practice and depending on the kinds of experiences that people have.
The underlying hypothesis here is that different areas of the brain, if they're active or if they're less active, might be related to different types of conscious experience.
Yes, I believe so. So, for example, some of the things that we've just been talking about, when a person is in the process of meditation or prayer, typically we see the frontal lobes turning on. We see the parietal lobes. I should say that these are very dynamic processes. And of course, anybody who has meditated knows that there's a big difference in terms of how you feel after 5 minutes of meditation, 20 minutes, a half hour, an hour, 2 hours. So things keep changing. And for example, with the parietal lobe, if you're focusing on an object, a candle, for example, Initially, your parietal lobe turns on because you're orienting yourself towards the candle. But as the meditation continues and you begin to screen out information, you begin to have this feeling of oneness, then that parietal lobe starts to shut down. And in a similar way, we've noticed this with the frontal lobe, that although the frontal lobe activity may be fairly high and keeps going higher as the practice gets more and more intense and the person is more and more concentrating on the object, then at some point where the person kind of loses the ability to continue that concentration, they kind of surrender to the experience, they let themselves just be taken over by the entire process, that the frontal lobe activity actually decreases. And so some of these very intense states may wind up being a state in which the frontal lobes have reduced activity, the parietal lobes have reduced activity, and maybe just some very core areas, some of the emotional centers of the brain that denote this as being very important, very profound feelings of love or joy or awe. These kind of come on and make the person realize how powerful of an experience this ultimately is.
Mm-hmm. One of the common features of pretty much every religion is that people come together in communities. Religion is very largely a social function. And I should think from the perspective of neurotheology, one might want to look for things like brainwave synchronization across a group of people when they engage together in a religious practice.
Definitely. This is something that we have not had. I have not personally had the opportunity to study yet, but you're absolutely right. We've definitely thought about the resonance or synchrony, as you said, of the brain and brain functions across individuals who are taking part in a group ritual. It'd be fascinating to really be able to see the differences in, people even doing the same kind of meditation or prayer by themselves versus with a group, and maybe be able to evaluate multiple people within that group to see if their brain patterns are moving together in some way or another, because certainly those group rituals can have a very dramatic effect on the brain, can help people feel connected to that entire group, and can have a very powerful effect on how people feel. So now, and it may be, one of the things we actually hypothesize too is that people who do a lot of individual rituals, they may be particularly sensitive to group rituals because their brain already is kind of sensitive to these experiences and these processes and these rhythms of the different rituals. So the idea that they may actually be able to experience group rituals in a more powerful way is also something that could be a very interesting thing to look at. But yes, getting to the basis of your question, I think an area for neurotheology to move into would be to differentiate the effects of group rituals versus individual rituals. And it's also, again, another opportunity going back to what we were talking about in terms of paradigm shifts. If we can see how brains or minds or consciousnesses can affect each other at a distance, even if they're not even in the same room, could really be fascinating. Could be amazing to be able to show how one brain is able to potentially communicate or connect with another person's brain somewhere else. So these are certain things. We've tried to explore this a little bit. We've done some preliminary work on this, but we need to design a much more robust study to account for all the different possible issues and variables. But it could be could wind up leading us down some incredible paths in terms of understanding the human brain and how our brains interact with each other.
Mm-hmm. And another area that I think would be very fruitful for the field of neurotheology is to look at the effect of different drugs. I know, speaking personally, but also for my whole generation, I think there was a renewed interest in mysticism, spirituality, and esoteric culture in general from the generation that came of age in the 1960s. And that's the same generation that began experimenting quite widely with marijuana and psychedelic drugs. I'd have to think that generationally speaking, there's something going on in the brains of those people related to those substances.
Absolutely. And this is another part of that puzzle, of that neurotheology neurotheology puzzle. The field of studying the effect of psychedelic compounds and different substances that affect the brain, especially those that have been connected with spiritual experiences like psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, and so forth. What's, from the neuro side of neurotheology, the great thing about studying these effects is that we know where these drugs go. So we can say, okay, psilocybin affects the serotonin system, or, cocaine affects the dopaminergic system, or something like that. So we can look at these effects, and of course, the other thing that's nice about them from a research study standpoint is that you can give them at a certain time, and then you can follow the experience that they have after it. So there's also an easier way of linking up some of the causal processes associated with them. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we also need to look at some of the phenomenal elements of these experiences. So is a spiritual experience that is associated with psilocybin, is it the same? Is it stronger, weaker than a more quote-unquote naturally occurring experience, like one through meditation or prayer? Yeah. A lot of the data that has been produced so far, and includes some data from my own work looking at a survey of people's most intense spiritual experiences, suggest that these psychedelically related experiences are every bit as powerful and as real feeling and as spiritual as the more non-psychedelically related experiences. So there's a lot to be learned there. Again, is it changing the brain, which then changes the experience? Is it changing the brain, which changes how the brain receives what's going on in the world around us? How do we understand what the nature of these experiences are and what they mean from an epistemological perspective? Are they real? Are they not real? Some really fascinating questions. But studying these kinds of experiences and trying to do it in a more systematic way, I think, is an essential part of what the future of neurotheology could be.
Now, I gather that in neuroscience in general, one of the main projects is something to sort of create an artificial simulation of telepathy, so that you could put some kind of a skull cap on a person and read their brain waves and then know what they're thinking.
Right. Well, yes, that is correct. There has been some very interesting research, almost trying to look at fMRI as a way of doing, like a lie detector, and they would have people, with two different ideas, and then they could tell the difference between which idea they were thinking about based on the neural patterns or the activity patterns. One of the downsides of that research, of course, and this again is a fundamentally important point for neurotheology, is the subjective consciousness side of things. So the problem with the research that you're talking about so far has been that we still have to ask the person to begin with what they're thinking or feeling. So I have to ask you, when are you thinking about, a fire truck versus when are you thinking about the ocean? And then, I can do that back and forth several times. Now I can look at your brain and say, well, think about either the fire truck or the ocean. And now I can tell you which one you might be thinking about. But I can't go into your brain. I can't take an image of your brain ahead of time and say, based on this pattern, he must be thinking about, getting his lunch now, or he must be thinking about, whether it's, sunset or not. So there's a limit to what we can do. There's always this fundamentally important part about the subjective qualitative nature of these experiences. And for me, we talked, at the very beginning about, my interest in neurotheology. For me, a very fundamental part of it is my own philosophical meditation, is my exploration of my own consciousness and what that exploration can lead to, how that can help me to understand my perspectives on the universe, my perspectives on reality, with the view that I could then theoretically go back and look at what's going on in my brain when I'm having these experiences, and try to bring all of that together. So for me, what neurotheology is striving to accomplish is to bring together the qualitative, subjective nature of our consciousness and our personal experiences with the biology of those experiences, and try to see how they match up and how we can use that information to address the ultimate question, which is what is the nature of reality, and how do we know that? How do we know what reality is?
Yeah, because for centuries, really, the field of theology has been quite separate from all scientific disciplines. In fact, as I recall, one of my earlier interviewees makes a point of saying that at the Council of Trent back in the 1600s, the church fathers passed a variety of resolutions that, faith is a matter for the church and science should stay out of it, and the physical world is a matter for science, and the church won't try to make pronouncements there.
Well, I've always said that part of why I feel that neurotheology has a bright future is because in many ways it's had a very prominent past. We haven't called it neurotheology, but if you go back into the history of humanity, there are two primary forces which have guided our path. One is the science and technology side, and the other is the religious and spiritual side. And so, to me, the idea of trying to bring them together, it could be extremely important for the future of humanity and how we think about things. And, I always try to emphasize to my religious or theological colleagues that this research, that what neurotheology provides, it doesn't get rid of any of the theological questions. It doesn't get rid of the question about God's existence or how we are to relate to God or whatever, or what the nature of spirituality is or the soul. But what it does is it brings a new perspective that we've never had before. So in the past, if we were arguing about free will, all we could argue about was free will. All we had was philosophical arguments. Should we have it? Should we not have it? Why should we have it? What does the Bible say? What does the Quran say? But now we have scientific studies that show what happens in the brain when you make a conscious choice, and when does it occur, and how does it occur, and what areas of the brain are involved. It doesn't fundamentally answer the question of whether we have free will or not either, but it does bring in a new perspective that we've never had before. So I do hope that going forward, neurotheology has this important opportunity to find ways of bringing together the science and the spiritual in a way that we've never been able to do before, with the hope that it is through that kind of hybrid process, that interdisciplinary process, that we might get to the answer to these fundamental questions.
Well, Andrew Newberg, this has been a fascinating discussion. I know we've just skimmed the surface of what is really a vast field, but I'm looking forward to the opportunity in the future to have more detailed conversations where we can really drill down and look at different meditative practices and or different kinds of psychopathologies and see what neurotheology has to say in some depth.
Absolutely. It's, again, part of what makes me so excited about neurotheology as a field is that it allows for a very broad overview of these experiences and practices and beliefs, but it also allows for a great deal of richness and depth of understanding these experiences. And I think another really important point is the idea of trying to get down to the uniqueness and the distinctiveness of each person's beliefs, each person's experiences, how they relate to their brain processes, but then again, exploding it up to thinking about this at the level of humanity. And can all of this information help individuals as well as all humanity work towards what arguably is a new enlightenment, a new way of integrating our knowledge, our wisdom from the past, our knowledge and wisdom of science today, and what we can learn from the future, and how we might be able to take these kinds of ideas in directions that help us to evolve, help us to grow, learn, to transcend ourselves, and to find, to have each of us find the enlightenment that hopefully everybody is striving for.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for being with me. I look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you. Me too.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.